A word before we begin. Included in this episode is a great deal of death, cruelty, torture, and sexual violence inflicted upon innocent civilians during a time of war. It is hard to learn about and hard to comprehend. I only include details to help you understand the context of the times and, oddly enough, maybe the choices that were made. I'll let you know when the most horrifying particulars are about to be discussed. That way you can skip them if you wish. Please take care. Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking that they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. The village was already burning, dozens already dead, when the word came to Charlie Company to round up the women, children, old men, and grandmothers and take them to a spot east of town. There, maybe 50 or more were gathered, pushed by uniformed men with M16 automatic weapons to stand on the rim of a drainage ditch. The commanding officer that day approached his second-in-command and said, "You know what to do with them." Then the CO left to handle other operations. When he returned, he asked what the officer standing guard over the now even larger crowd was doing. Private First Class Paul Meadlow responded, "As you said, I'm watching them." Second Lieutenant William Calley turned angry. He asked, "How come they're not dead? I want them dead." It was mid-morning on Saturday, March 16th, 1968, in the village of Sun Mi, a section of which was My Lai 4. The area in which the village stood was also known in the United States military vernacular as Pinkville, because the known communist stronghold was always shaded pink on maps. The region near My Lai, in northern South Vietnam, had been Viet Cong held for about 20 years. This was market day. This was where rice was grown and harvested by any able body, where children played. Most men of military age were someplace else. By the end of the day, when the Americans had gone and the town was destroyed, when maybe 500 villagers were dead, strewn across roads, in homes, and in ditches, one of the most atrocious war crimes ever committed by American troops was already being covered up. It would take more than a year for the American public to hear what happened there that day. It would be jet fuel to the already massive conflagration raging in this country about the morality of the war in Southeast Asia. Baby killers, people said, murderers. Because this war, already distasteful and politically wrought, was one thing. But what happened in My Lai was a crime that went beyond debate. It was a crime against rules of war, a crime against humanity. It was a crime of the century that had killed hundreds and, as quickly, brought shame to a nation of 200 million. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Wild Grain. This is one of those things that makes winter feel a lot more tolerable.
Especially when it's cold, dark, and no one wants to go back out once you're home.
Exactly. Wild Grain is the first baked from frozen box for sourdough breads, artisanal pastries, and fresh pastas, and everything bakes in about 25 minutes or less.
This is the part where you tell them about the sourdough.
I will never not talk about the sourdough. It's warm, it's crusty, and it's made with simple ingredients you can actually pronounce. No preservatives, no shortcuts.
And the freezer aspect is clutch. It's like having a tiny artisan bakery on standby.
Totally. Wild grain boxes are fully customizable too. There's a variety box, a gluten-free box, a vegan box, and a new protein box.
It really does make staying in feel like a choice instead of a compromise.
There's nothing like having an artisan bakery in your freezer to chase away the winter chill. Now is the best time to stand and enjoy comforting homemade meals with Wild Grain. I highly recommend giving it a try.
Right now, Wild Grain is offering our listeners $30 off your first box.
Plus, free croissants for life when you go to wildgrain.com/COTC to start your subscription today.
That's $30 off your first box and free croissants for life at wildgrain.com/COTC or use promo code COTC at checkout.
The Vietnam War remains one of this country's most controversial military engagements. By the time 1968 rolled around, the United States had already spent more than a decade trying to stop communism from spreading into South Vietnam. To be brief, we were supporting allies committed to that purpose, a confusing stance, many thought, in a place very few could have located on a map. Presidents as far back as Harry Truman had grappled with what to do there. By 1964, when Lyndon Johnson was in the White House, second thoughts were being voiced. He even told the American public that, quote, "We are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves," end quote. He would eat those words because by the end of 1968, there were in excess of 500,000 U.S. troops in the country, the most that would ever serve there. After 1968, those numbers declined sharply, in part because of My Lai. What the American troops on the ground in 1968 experienced was a war like none had fought before, though the slog through the Pacific Theater in World War II came close. Heavily wooded, swampy, and dense, this was the time when a defoliating chemical called Agent Orange was dropped on the landscape and on troops to remove enemy cover and disrupt food supplies. The tactical herbicide contained the toxic carcinogen dioxin, which did the job, albeit too well. But that's another story. In any case, troops plodded through unfamiliar, humid terrain where war consisted of relentless skirmishes. Nothing and nowhere felt safe. The average age of on-ground troops during World War II was 26. In Vietnam, the myth is that it was 19, but in reality it was closer to 22. Regardless, many of those young men had been drafted, as in they had not volunteered and had not considered military service to be their calling. In a word, they were hardly adults. They just wanted to survive their one-year tour and go home intact. So it was that in January and February 1968, the inexperienced men of Company C, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry, 11th Infantry Brigade of the Americall Division got their first taste of war. Assigned to Task Force Barker, they may have thought they'd be welcomed in South Vietnam like their fathers had been in World War II after liberating France. But that wasn't the case. The task force was assigned to the Viet Cong-controlled Son Tin district, where they faced open hostility, never certain who was friend or foe. This is Fred Widmer, a specialist 4th class in Charlie Company, speaking in 2015 to PBS's American Experience.
We started pulling regular patrols end of January, beginning of February. Once we started down to the Pinkville area, we started to lose people. They were being picked off one by one. This is when we got our initiation into the realities of Vietnam with booby traps, mines, snipers.
Captain Ernest Medina, one of their superior officers during those months, had trained them in Hawaii and knew they would harden fast. Still, the company had been together long enough to grow attached to one another. Each casualty hit them hard. According to the My Lai massacre, the history of the Vietnam War's most notorious atrocity, the Charles Rivers editors wrote that, on February 25th, The men from Charlie Company, quote, stumbled into a minefield and, in the chaos, 3 men were killed and 16 wounded. Medina, who was with the company at the time, responded coolly, directing medical aid to the wounded while working with mine detectors to clear a safe path out. He was later awarded a Silver Star for his valor that day, end quote. Much later, survivors told PBS that the first to die was Bill Weber, someone everyone liked. He stepped on a mine and was blown in two, split vertically, in an image they could still picture nearly 30 years later. It was as if, one soldier said, the earth became the enemy. Charlie Company believed the locals knew about the mines, but hadn't warned them. Lieutenant Roger Lowe told John Sack, author of the controversial My Lai recounting Lieutenant Calley, his own story, said, quote, these people are just as much VC as the ones that planted those minefields, end quote. Here's Joe Grimes, another soldier who was in the company in early 1968, remembering each death.
It is just like if you had a wound and they would stick something in that wound and go a little bit deeper. Every time somebody else got killed, it was like that wound and it'd go a little deeper. And the hurt never stopped.
Man by man, day by day, they lost faith that anyone in that country could be trusted. They believed that no one was going to help them. This is Widmer again.
Finally, you just throw the rule book away. The rules of the game have changed. Instead of just going through villages, casually going through them, you went into villages, started ripping apart. That became the standard now. We're not nice guys anymore.
2 days before they deployed to Pinkville, Popular Sergeant George Cox died. He too stepped on a mine. Hardened now with hate, Company C was briefed by their superiors as they were about to be dropped into Pinkville on a Saturday morning. In Vietnam, military success was gauged, officially and unofficially, by how many enemy combatants you killed. It was how to keep score, and apparently, the message was sent that it was time for this division to get on with it. To that end, Michael Bilton, a British investigative journalist and producer of 4 Hours in My Lai, said that Brigade Commanding Officer Colonel Orrin Henderson made a point of winding up Captain Medina, who in turn wound up the boots on the ground. Captain Medina had been with the company when they took sniper fire and was respected by them. He had personally picked up Weber's torn body that day they had spent dodging bullets and mines, but he knew they did not have real combat experience. They had not been part of the very recent Tet Offensive that was still ongoing in more populated parts of the country. They needed to be prepared. To that end, they were told to expect a serious confrontation when they got to My Lai. The most recent intelligence was that they'd be facing the Viet Cong's 48th Local Force Battalion. That unit operated out of the Quang Ngai province and was mostly guerrilla fighters, which admittedly made them hard to distinguish from the civilian population. They had been part of Tet. Charlie Company was informed they would likely be outnumbered 2-1. Lawrence LaCroix remembered what he was told as he prepared to get into the helicopter to take him to My Lai.
We were to shoot literally anything that moved. If it was growing, cut it down. If it was a building, burn it. If it was a well, poison it. If it was alive, kill it.
They were, in essence, to expect the worst and return it in kind. To prepare, they packed 540 rounds of ammunition, triple the usual amount. They were to be accompanied by 9 helicopters and 6 gunships. En route to the location, Delta Company from the 6th and 11th Artillery Battalion shot randomly into the village for 3 to 5 minutes. The goal was to clear the landing zone. Villagers headed to Saturday Market scattered for cover. A few armed men, driven from nearby fields, were killed by gunship gunners as they ran. Helicopters that had brought the troops reported receiving enemy fire as they lifted off to return to base. U.S. Army Judge Advocate General Historian Colonel Fred Borch explains how the morning proceeded.
They're airlifted in by helicopter. They get to the hamlet of My Lai about 7 a.m. in the morning, and there's no fire coming their way. There's no sign of enemy action at all. There are no booby traps. There are no mines. They're in a small village, and all they find are women, old men, and children, no military-age males. And these people are going around about their daily chores, having breakfast, and getting ready to do what they do in the village. And so from the beginning, the soldiers are really confused about what they need to do. And an important point is, no one ever instructed Callie or his men what to do if all they encountered were unresisting, unarmed civilians.
Around 7:50 a.m., someone fired their weapon. Hell broke loose. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Hiya Health. Everyone's talking about New Year's resolutions right now, but here's the one that actually keeps me up at night as a parent. Our kids are growing up surrounded by ultra-processed food, and we're only beginning to understand the long-term effects.
Meanwhile, a lot of kids' vitamins are basically candy pretending to be helpful.
That's why we switched to Hiya. They took the opposite approach. Zero sugar, zero gummy additives, just clean nutrition.
And somehow kids still love them. The ingredient list is refreshingly short. Plus, the bottle situation deserves credit.
Oh yeah, kids get this cool reusable bottle with their first order, stickers and all, and then eco-friendly refills show up every month.
And then there's the greens. If getting your kids to eat vegetables feels like an impossible daily battle, Hiya's new Kids Daily Greens plus Superfoods is a total game changer. It's basically chocolate milk stuffed with veggies. You just mix a scoop with milk or non-dairy option, and somehow you actually enjoy it.
And we've worked out a special deal with Hiya for their best-selling children's vitamin. Receive 50% off your first order. To claim this deal, go to hiyahealth.com/COTC.
This deal isn't available on their regular website.
That's hiyahealth.com/COTC. Get your kids the full body nourishment they need to grow into healthy adults. When Charlie Company hit the ground at My Lai that morning, Captain Medina wasn't with them. The man in charge was 24-year-old Second Lieutenant William Callie, rusty to his men for his red hair. He grew up in South Florida. He was not a large man. He stood something like 5'3" or 5'4". He was a high school graduate. Per historian Borch, he was 666th in a class of 731. He dropped out of junior college. He was drafted into service, and because he had spent a few years at a Georgia military school as a boy, he was accepted into officer candidate school. There, he was in the bottom quarter of his class. And yet, the Army made him a second lieutenant and placed a company of non-commissioned soldiers under his command. And please note the chronology of what happened that morning, as reported by varied sources, differs in the specifics, but is largely as I'll lay out here. Also, I told you I'd warn you about the bad part. This is the bad part. You can skip ahead about 6 minutes to avoid the worst of it. After the first shot had been fired, the men of Charlie Company responded in kind in a wholesale cacophony of automatic fire. Seeing faces inside huts, they threw grenades into the hooches that housed families and had taken cover there. They slaughtered livestock. They chased villagers down roads to gun them down. They stabbed pregnant women with bayonets, telling each other that you could kill 2 of the enemy with 1 deep stab. They killed nursing mothers with bullets that first destroyed the infant at their breast. One soldier watched another treat a small child as a piñata on his bayonet. People were thrown into wells and then blown apart by grenades that followed them. A soldier would later report that a group of mothers who were shielding their children were sprayed with bullets. When their children began running to escape the gunfire, they too were mowed down. The butchery continued unabated. Private Bernardo Simpson told the author of 4 Hours in My Lai of his personal involvement that day. Quote, "I cut their throats, cut off their hands, cut out their tongues, their hair, scalped them. I did it. A lot of people were doing it, and I just followed. I lost all sense of direction." End quote. According to Smithsonian Magazine, Simpson later died by suicide. The commission that later investigated the massacre also chronicled multiple incidents of rape and sexual torture. It was noted that many of the women had not screamed very loudly during these encounters. Their tongues had been cut out. The commission made note of people being burned to death, mutilated, with initials or numbers carved into their skin. A group of maybe a dozen women and children were praying at a temple when they were shot in the head by passing soldiers. A haze of smoke covered everything but the horror. Assigned to be with them that day was Army photographer Ronald Haberly. He took pictures of everything he witnessed. He would call it complete carnage. He would later tell the investigators that, quote, "There were some Vietnamese people, maybe 15 of them, women and children included, walking on a dirt road maybe 100 yards away. All of a sudden, the GIs just opened up with M16 fire. They were shooting at them with 79 grenade launchers. I couldn't believe what I was seeing," end quote. He would later testify that he saw a group of GIs gang raping a 15-year-old while other women and children were held at gunpoint to watch. He took a picture of that group, and minutes later, he took another picture of the scene. All the women were dead. Understanding the unrestrained savagery of what he was seeing, Haberly shot 2 sets of pictures, one in black and white, which he would turn over to his superiors, and another in color that he would keep to turn over later to investigators. Pham Thanh Kong, who now runs the memorial site in the village, was 8 years old that March day.
Around 8:30, 3 American soldiers came to my house. They pushed 6 of us down into the shelter and threw a hand grenade in behind us. And then they used their machine guns to shoot us down. My entire family was blown into pieces. The only person left alive was me.
There was no enemy fire coming from anywhere. The chopper pilots realized early on that those running from the village were not armed and were no young men. Dan Millions, one of those pilots of a medevac unit, said he began to see bodies accumulating on the ground in shocking numbers. Women, children, old people. Around 9 a.m., Callie ordered his men to round up survivors. When he returned to find them still alive, he questioned Meadlow. Per Meadlow's testimony, Callie, quote, backed off 20 or 30 feet and started shooting into the people, the Viet Cong, shooting automatic. He was beside me. He burned 4 or 5 magazines. I burned off a few, about 3. I helped shoot them, end quote. An unidentified survivor, then a small child who remembered being awash in brain and blood, told Al Jazeera television that
they ordered all of the families to sit or stand in the ditch. Then they shot. After 5 minutes, they shot the second time. If they heard weeping, they shot a third time.
The men doing the shooting remember that they did not speak much to each other. One said that's because they were too busy. Around 9:15, a ceasefire order was issued by Medina to the 2nd Platoon. The 1st and 3rd platoons did not receive or were not told of the order. They continued as before for at least another hour or so. Later, estimates would vary. There is no official number of how many died that day, but it ranges from a low of 350 to as many as 564. Most experts place the number around 500. One soldier told investigators that once they started, they didn't know how to stop. They had orders. But such orders, if they'd been given, were illegal. The killing an astonishing breach of military law. It is likely that by 11 or so, there was no one left to kill. That same morning, sometime between 9 and 10, Observation helicopter pilot Warrant Officer Hugh Thompson and his crew were flying reconnaissance. Door gunner Larry Coburn and Specialist 4th Class Glenn Andreatta were also on board the Raven helicopter. They were not gunships, but mostly used for scouting. They spent the early part of the morning marking the wounded they saw in the open fields with smoke so that, as per procedure, American medics could find them and render aid. Soon, Thompson realized that when he swung back around to check on those he'd marked, they were all now dead. Extremely concerned that things had gone terribly awry down there, he had Coburn and Andreatta mark a Vietnamese woman who had been clearly hurt. Thompson hung back and watched as Captain Medina approached the injured woman and shot her in the head. What the hell was happening down there? Now, the smoke from the village had cleared a bit, and a gravely angry Thompson could see the people in the ditch and more Vietnamese being chased down by American GIs. He could see the Vietnamese were not resisting, but were trying to shield the youngest among them. His fury and disbelief were obvious to his crew. He told them he would land the chopper and try to put a stop to this. He landed, got out, and approached the lieutenant in charge. Thompson and the lieutenant had words, but the chase was called off. Thompson got back in his chopper and circled to the ditch where so many dead were now stacked. There were now more waiting on the ravine's edge to be similarly slaughtered. Michael Bilton, the documentary producer, explained what happened next. The second voice you hear is that of Gunner Coburn.
He approached this soldier that was near the ditch and said, "These are civilians. We got to help them out." And the soldier said, "Yeah, we'll help them out of their misery." Mr. Thompson went through every scenario he could to give benefit of the doubt to the men on the ground. He did not want to believe that our people were doing this. And he came back, got in the aircraft. We lifted off, and we were 15, 20 feet off the ground, and we heard automatic weapons fire.
The soldier he approached was Lieutenant Calley. Before taking off, Thompson heard Calley tell him to mind his own business. Thompson wasn't in charge here, Calley was. Thompson returned to his chopper as Calley ordered the shooting to commence. A volley loud and long enough to make clear who was in charge. Meadlow explained what Calley said to him.
Lieutenant Calley told me, "Meadlow, we got another job to do." So we started pushing them off, and we started shooting them. So then all together we just pushed them all off and just started using automatics on them.
Enough was enough. Thompson was done asking. He saw a group of American soldiers with a smaller group of maybe 9 or 10 villagers. He landed the chopper between the Americans and the Vietnamese. Colburn again.
Mr. Thompson calculated they had less than 30 seconds to live. He told us, "I'm going to go over to the bunker and get these people out myself. And if these American soldiers fire on these people or me when I'm getting them out of the bunker, shoot them."
Here's Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes talking first to Coburn, then Thompson about that. Asked if Thompson had put himself in harm's way at that moment, Thompson doesn't speak, but Coburn does.
Yes, sir, he did. And he didn't even take a weapon with him. He had a sidearm. He didn't even have it drawn. He just placed himself in harm's path. And I was thinking that at that point, anything could have happened. And we watched Mr. Thompson go to the bunker and bring the people out.
There was just, no value whatsoever on life.
Knowing that Dan Millions and Brian Livingston, pilots of medevac helicopters, were nearby, Thompson radioed them to come get these people and ferry them to the nearby hospital in Quang Ngai. Both men, equally stunned by what they had seen, did what Thompson asked. Coburn was a hero that day.
We went back to the ditch, and I saw some motion down in the ditch. I saw this child move.
Doba again.
I lifted my head up and saw a helicopter landing in the rice fields. I was really scared. Wasn't sure if they would shoot again. But when I lifted my head, I saw 3 American soldiers approach, so I pretended to be dead. But the Americans, the 3 of them came down into the ditch. I looked up a second time, and they came and pulled me out.
It was Coburn who had lifted the boy out by the back of the child's shirt, hoping he wouldn't fall out of it as they ran back to the helicopter. The child was taken to Quang Ngai, where he was left with a nun. They told the nun that his family was likely all dead. It was just past noon. Thompson returned to the base, where he broke his flight helmet after hurling it to the ground in anger. Also back at base, Captain Medina was telling his superiors about the success they had had that day confronting the enemy. The report, which was later made public, read, quote, "The operation was well planned, well executed, and successful. Friendly casualties were light, and the enemy suffered a hard blow. The infantry unit on the ground and helicopters were able to assist civilians in leaving the area and in caring for and/or evacuating the wounded," end quote. He added that 128 Viet Cong had been killed. 1 American soldier had been wounded when he accidentally shot himself in the foot. They had recovered 3 weapons. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Beam's Dream Powder. Every January, I tell myself the same thing. This is the year I get it together. Better habits, clearer thinking, more discipline.
A strong annual tradition.
But here's what I finally realized. None of that matters if I'm not sleeping well.
Sleep is the keystone habit.
Exactly. So this year, instead of a giant resolution list, I started with a habit that makes everything else possible: real, consistent sleep. That's why I started using Beam's Dream Powder.
And this one actually stuck.
It did. Dream is made with clean, science-backed ingredients like reishi, magnesium, L-theanine, apigenin, and melatonin, formulated to help you fall asleep faster, stay asleep, and wake up refreshed. No crash, no fog.
And it tastes like dessert, which feels unfair.
My favorite flavor is brownie batter. Beam has already improved over 28 million nights of sleep. So if you've been waiting to try Dream, this is the time. Go to shopbeam.com/COTC, use code COTC, and take advantage of my exclusive offer for up to 40% off Beam's Dream Powder.
With the discount
code COTC,
you can get their best-selling Dream Powder for just $39.
Seriously, how much would you pay for a great night's sleep? With my code, it's about $1.25 a night. Go to shopbeam.com/COTC today. When Thompson and his crew touched down at Landing Zone Dottie, the incensed warrant officer went to Colonel Henderson to report everything he had seen. A small aside, all copies of that first official after-action report have been lost or destroyed. In any case, Colonel Henderson, who had just received that lofty rank a day before, said he would send Thompson's concerns up the chain of command. Thompson would later say that Henderson took limited notes on a yellow legal pad and asked no questions. A similar account of the atrocities had been filed by Brigade Correspondent Jay Roberts, who was told by his commanding officer, "Don't worry about it." He then told Roberts, whose job it was to craft reports to be read by the Pentagon, to write a good story about the day. Word somehow reached Brigadier General George Young, who ordered Henderson to look into any unusual occurrences that had happened there. Henderson's response was to ask a group of men from Charlie Company if anything untoward had happened. They responded, as a group, that they couldn't think of anything. They were not questioned individually or at length. On that Sunday, March 17th, the New York Times ran a story about how the fighting in and around Quang Ngai province had been heavy on Saturday, with, quote, United States soldiers sweeping the area, end quote. The unbylined piece made prominent mention of the 150 men from the Americal Division encountering enemy forces, with 128 Viet Cong being killed, while the Americans took only 2 casualties. Near the end of the communique from Army spokespeople, this line later stood out. Quote, South Vietnamese casualties were described as light, end quote. Henderson reported back to Young on March 19th. That report has also vanished. But there is evidence that he had been adamant that American soldiers would never do such a thing as that which was being alleged. Young accepted this and closed the complaint. On April 11th, Viet Cong soldiers reported to their superiors that more than 400 had been killed at My Lai. On April 24th, 5 weeks after the slaughter, Henderson informed Major General Samuel W. Coster, his commanding officer in the Americal Division, of the action at My Lai. He assured Coster that, at most, 20 non-combatants had been killed. He underlined that statement by adding that if the general heard that the number was larger than 20, it was propaganda cooked up by the Viet Cong to, quote, discredit the Americans in the eyes of the Vietnamese people, end quote. Both Henderson and Coster left it there. Rather horribly, the day after the massacre, PFC Meadlow was walking down a hill with his platoon when he stepped on a mine. One of his feet was blown off. It was heavily reported that the last thing he yelled at Callie was, "God got me. He'll get you for what we did." Otherwise, the horror of March 16th held no particular tragic hold on the platoon or company, which continued on across the region, searching and destroying per orders. Much later, many of them wondered what had made them react as they did that day. But war was not supposed to be easy, and orders were meant to be followed. Some regretted it immediately, others in hindsight. A few did neither. They bragged to other soldiers they met about their big day of killing, despite an express admonition from Medina that everyone stay silent about what happened at My Lai. Some went home, their tours over. Some stayed for another tour of duty. Hugh Thompson did not fare as well. There's no paper trail to follow to know what really happened, but in the days that followed, Thompson found himself flying ever more dangerous missions. Here's Mike Wallace again.
He and Larry Colburn told us that the U.S. military had stopped providing him with adequate backup on his chopper missions after My Lai.
In a matter of a month or so, he was forced down 5 times, crashing 5 helicopters. On a mission out of Da Nang, he defied death yet again, but broke his back. After returning to the States, Thompson became a pariah. He received death threats. Mutilated animals showed up on his porch. Thompson is gracious about all of it.
This was because the truth, I don't think, was out there. I was somebody that was crying and whining about a few people getting accidentally killed. There was no accidental killing that day. It was murder.
Even from the distance of 36 years, his anger still burned. But he was not the only American serviceman who would abhor the cold-blooded murder on that day. Sergeant Ron Ridenhour was a natural-born journalist. He was a 22-year-old kid from Arizona, serving in the 11th Infantry Brigade in Vietnam in 1968. He had trained early on in Hawaii with some of the guys who later were assigned to the platoons that had ravaged the village. In early April of that year, as soldiers on leave often do, he found himself talking to several of those who had been part of the massacre. The stories he heard were shocking, repugnant, and they came from different men at different times, though together they created a consistent narrative of a terrible crime. Ridenhour did his own digging, finding a few negligible reports from higher-ups who had either fudged what they knew or out-and-out buried it. Charlie Company's Larry LaCroix told him in detail that Callie had led the massacre. In November 1968, Ridenhour found Michael Bernhardt, a private who had refused to participate in the killings. Ridenhour finished his tour in Vietnam in late 1968, and the story of My Lai went with him back to the United States. He kept at it. In March 1969, his sense of justice nagging at him relentlessly, he figured as an American citizen, he had one weapon: stamps. He wrote a letter, actually 30 of them, each a long and copiously detailed recounting with testimonial evidence included of that March day. He asked everyone to whom he addressed the letter to look into it for the sake of the country. The letter went out to those who represented him in Congress, to Senator Barry Goldwater, to anti-war Senator Eugene McCarthy, to Senator Ted Kennedy. He sent it to Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird, to Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Earl Wheeler, to General William Westmoreland, to President Richard Nixon. Arizona Congressman Morris Udall responded swiftly. Known as a strong advocate to end the war, he called for an official inquiry. When General Westmoreland, the commander of all U.S. forces there, got the letter, he immediately ordered Colonel Howard Whitaker, himself a decorated war veteran, to talk to those Ridenour had named. He instructed his inspector general to launch an investigation, a real one. The reckoning was coming. We know word eventually reached General Westmoreland that a formal complaint had been made by Warrant Officer Thompson, though no such reports can be found in the official records. So investigators sought out Thompson, who said he had lodged formal and informal reports, but that neither had been treated seriously. He identified Callie, by photo lineup, as the officer he had spoken to in his first encounter with the men on the ground. In private sessions of testimony being heard by Congress, Thompson was lauded for his courage in the circumstances, but not by everyone, according to Thompson.
One of the senior congressmen during these secret testimonies say if anybody goes to jail that day, it'll be that helicopter pilot.
In July 1969, PFC Meadlow told everything he knew to the higher-ups. By early August, the whole thing, deeply under wraps and kept from the public, was now in the hands of the Criminal Investigative Unit of the Office of the Inspector General of the United States. When the Secretary of the Army testified in front of the secret congressional committee, he made a point of including Ron Haberle's photographs so they too could see the horror of that day. On September 5th, charges were filed against Lieutenant William Callie. He was held at Fort Benning, Georgia. That fall, a separate Westmoreland investigation was placed in the hands of General William R. Pierce. Its focus was to be on whether a military cover-up had followed the attack. Known later by the public and press as the Pierce Committee, this inquiry would solicit the testimony of 399 witnesses and result in a series of court-martial trials. The ongoing work by those investigators was not reported, except for a 3-paragraph brief in the New York Times that stated that a 26-year-old infantry officer named William L. Callie had been charged with murder, quote, in the deaths of an unspecified number of civilians in Vietnam, end quote. The vagueness didn't seem to concern the editors at the Times or Washington Post or any other news outlet for that matter. That is, until investigative journalist Seymour Hersh got a tip on October 22, 1969, that a large number of court-martials were taking place in Fort Benning because of a large-scale atrocity that had occurred in South Vietnam the previous spring. The source mentioned that those who were killed that day were not enemy combatants, but unarmed civilians. The death count had been high. The number of civilians killed had been chronicled by the Americans as Viet Cong guerrillas. According to Hersh, writing in Harper's Magazine in 2018, quote, even those who supported the war in Vietnam were troubled by the reliance on body counts in assessing progress. It was clear that many of those claimed to be enemy soldiers killed in combat were civilians who may have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, or just were there, living where their ancestors had lived for generations, end quote. No one worked their sources harder than Hersh. He found the name of Callie's attorney in Salt Lake, who told Hersh that Callie wasn't going to accept a plea deal because he was not going to take the fall for the mistakes of a whole raft of officers who had made the decision to destroy that village. Hersh wrote the story, which ultimately was passed on by the New York Times, Life, and Look magazines. In the case of the Times, editors there had insisted that Hersh add a paragraph high up in the story framing the massacre's significance against what they saw as the war's everyday brutality. Hirsch had refused to do so. The nation knew the significance without him telling them. The Washington Post said they'd run it, but rewrote it without Hirsch's consent to be a watered-down story of some Army arrests. Angry but determined to see his story published as he wrote it, Hirsch helped create something called the Dispatch News Service to sell the piece to the New York Post, the Chicago Sun-Times, and the St. Louis Dispatch, as well as to about 30-plus other smaller newspapers. Here's Hirsch later explaining one horrific detail his reporting uncovered. Hit the fast-forward button twice if you'd like to skip it. Meadlow told him that after he and his cohorts opened fire on a group of people,
they heard a noise, and some mother at the bottom of the ditch had put a boy about 2 years old under her stomach, and somehow the bullets had not penetrated. They had repeatedly fired so nobody would survive. And they heard a keening noise, and it was the noise of a child crying and screaming as he crawled his way through the bodies and got to the top full of other people's blood and began to run in fear. 2, maybe perhaps 3. And the officer in charge, Callie turned to Paul Meadlow, who had been shooting most sort of like an automat, where when others stopped. Somehow this he could not do, and he just said, no, I couldn't do it. So in this great moment of braggadocio, Cali officers had a weapon called a carbine, a smaller rifle, ran behind the kid and shot him in the back of the head as he was running away.
The stories began publishing on November 12th. The ground under Americans shook a bit. Then, on November 20th, Army photographer Ron Haberly, who had grown up in Cleveland, gave his photos to the Plain Dealer to publish. The caption that appeared on the front page that Thursday read, in part, quote, "This particular photograph shows a clump of bodies of South Vietnamese civilians, which includes women and children. Why they were killed raises one of the most momentous questions of the war in Vietnam." This is David Brinkley, a national news anchor for NBC.
The Cleveland Plain Dealer printed today a series of photographs it says it got from an Army combat photographer, and it says the pictures show the bodies of South Vietnamese killed by the Americans.
The newspapers took tremendous heat. Editors there had told the Army that they were going ahead with the publication and were told that doing so would interfere with the rights of those charged. The Plain Dealer responded that it was doing so in order, quote, "to protect the constitutional rights of the public," end quote. The country recoiled in abject horror. The war was now an almost indisputable catastrophe. It had always been so on political grounds, but was now so on moral ones. Still, in early December, a Wall Street Journal poll showed that most Americans didn't believe it happened. But the story didn't go away. Just before the end of the year, President Nixon publicly addressed the issue, saying he was sure it was an isolated event. The CID had found evidence implicating some 45 members of Charlie Company of murder and of gross violation of the rules of war. They recommended charges against dozens. When Piers finished his review that spring, Captain Medina was charged with premeditated murder of 100 Vietnamese citizens. 24 others were also charged. That included Colonel Henderson, who was cited for dereliction of duty, perjury, and failure to report a war crime. Inside the military, opinions varied as to who should answer for the massacre, or if it should be dismissed as a collateral circumstance associated with a war that followed a vastly different path than earlier wars and one which few understood. And while it seemed that the Army was going to clean house, the first court-martial of Sergeant Charles Hutton, who had been charged with the murder of 6 civilians, to which he had openly admitted before trial, ended in an acquittal. So did most of the rest. Callie awaited his day in court. His case was handed to the very inexperienced JAG officers to prosecute. They knew they had an uphill battle. JAG Corps historian Fred Borch, speaking on the 50th anniversary of My Lai on C-SPAN.
Their big fear is jury nullification. You'll remember the Vietnam War has very much split the country a lot of arguments about why we should be there, and is Cali a scapegoat? And the result is a lot of pressure, a lot of beliefs that maybe there'll be jury nullification here.
Jury nullification, as you might recall, is when juries know the law but disagree with it and thus disregard it. Cali's defense was simple. The man had only done what Medina had told him to do. On the witness stand, Medina stood firm in that he never gave that order. He even scoffed at the notion that he wanted civilians to die. This, despite the fact that 21 men from Charlie Company testified that they had been directed by Medina to kill everyone in the village. Medina never wavered and was never convicted of sanctioning or participating in the savagery. Cali's jury of 1 colonel, 4 majors, and a captain deliberated for 79 hours. They found Cali guilty of premeditated murder of 22 innocents. Although he could have gotten death, he was sentenced to life in Leavenworth, the military's maximum security prison in Kansas. He was also dismissed from the Army. America had watched the trial closely, and while some issued a sigh of relief, many thought Cali had been unjustly blamed. Some draft board members resigned. Veterans turned in their badges, and a Free Cali movement began. Governor Jimmy Carter, a former U.S. Navy officer, asked his state's drivers to turn on their lights to show their indignation, and the Indiana governor ordered flags flown at half-staff. People called their congressional representatives and sent more than 300,000 letters to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Nixon then said he would review the case, per his role as commander-in-chief. He ordered that Cali wouldn't be sent to Leavenworth, but would remain in his living quarters at Fort Benning under something akin to house arrest until all his appeals had been exhausted. In all, there were 13 officers and enlisted men charged in the March 16, 1968 massacre. Another dozen officers were charged with covering up the crime. Only 4 officers and 2 enlisted soldiers would end up being tried. The rest had their charges dismissed based on lack of evidence. Only Cali was convicted. In a remarkably short period of time, Cali's life sentence was shortened to 20 years. Then the Secretary of the Army reduced it to 10. He was paroled in November 1974, having served about 3 years, almost all of it under house arrest. General Pierce, genuinely appalled that the United States Army had let this happen and then let it drop like it was unimportant, summed up that the My Lai massacre was, quote, a failure of a chain of command at all levels, end quote. As a result, the Army put new emphasis on teaching professional ethics and the rules of war as laid out by the Hague and Geneva Conventions. They say they developed something called the Army ethic, which emphasizes that soldiers must see themselves as honorable servants of the nation and must recognize the dignity and worth of all people. Post-My Lai, it's not uncommon for legal advisors to be included when commanders draw up plans for any engagement with any enemy. But the story of what happened that March day in 1968 lives with the U.S. military, as if it had been bleached into their bones. In February 1991, the night before his subordinate brigade commanders launched their assault on Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein's forces, then Major General Ronald H. Griffith, commanding the 1st Armored Division, told them, quote, "No My Lai in this division. Do you hear me?" End quote. Hugh Thompson, a recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, was frequently invited to West Point to speak on military ethics. In 1998, he, Larry Coburn, and Glenn Andreatta were awarded the Soldier's Medal, the Army's highest military decoration for non-combat valor. Andreatta's was awarded posthumously, as he had died while still in Vietnam, not long after he flew with Thompson that day. Thompson died in 2006. William Cali died in April of 2024. On his death certificate, when it asked if he had ever served in the U.S. Armed Forces, someone marked no. In researching this case, journalist Amy Wilson read newspaper accounts and academic papers about the event. She watched the wide array of lectures on the internet that take on the subject and took note of the remarks of all who had been there and agreed to be interviewed. She read The My Lai Massacre, The History of the Vietnam War's Most Notorious Atrocity by Charles Rivers editors. She is particularly beholden to the PBS series on My Lai and to its helping her understanding the timeline of events. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Head to www.grabbagcollab.com for exclusive content related to this show and access to other series on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this case was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and sometimes my child, Hunt Van Benskoten. Other music comes from Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, please help us out by rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts. Also tell your friends. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com. On Instagram, we're @centuriespod, and you can find us on the Crimes of the Centuries Facebook page.